Welcome to Sleepless Philosophers, where deep ideas meet restful nights. If you enjoy these journeys through philosophy, please like and subscribe and turn on notifications for daily uploads. To support the channel, consider leaving a super thanks. Any amount helps us continue creating content. You can also become a member to request video topics. We're not monetized, so your support truly makes the difference. Now let the philosophy begin. Synesthesia. Paradox. Why numbers have colours and sounds have tastes. A person looks at the number 5 and sees it as blue, not imagines it as blue, not associates it with blue, but actually sees blue, experiences colour as an intrinsic property of the number. And another person hears music and tastes chocolate, hears certain chords, and the taste appears involuntarily, automatically. And these experiences are synesthesia, are cross-modal sensory experiences where stimulation in one modality produces perception in another. And synesthesia is not metaphor, is not learned association, is a genuine perceptual phenomenon experienced by roughly 4% of the population. And the paradox is that synesthetes experience properties that are not physically present, see colours that are not in the stimulus, taste flavours that have no source, and yet these experiences are consistent, are reliable. The same numbers always evoke the same colours, the same sounds always evoke the same tastes, and this reliability distinguishes synesthesia from imagination or association, shows that synesthesia is automatic, is perceptual rather than cognitive, and the phenomenon reveals something fundamental about how the brain is organised, shows that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, but can communicate, can influence each other. And synesthesia represents an extreme of this cross-modal interaction, represents a neural architecture where connections between sensory areas are stronger than normal, are sufficient to produce conscious experiences in one modality when another is stimulated. Imagine being a grapheme colour synesthete, the most common form, where letters and numbers evoke colours, and you read this text and every letter has its own colour. A is red, B is green, C is yellow, and the colours are vivid, are as clear as real colours, are not vague or imagined but are perceptually present. And when you see the letter A, you cannot help but see red. The colour is automatic, is triggered by the visual form of the letter, and this colouring happens for all letters and numbers, creates a richly coloured experience of reading. And while this might sound beautiful, it can also be distracting, can interfere with reading when the printed colours conflict with synesthetic colours, can create confusion. And yet for synesthetes, this is normal, is how the world has always looked. And they are often surprised to learn that others do not experience letters as coloured, that the colours are unique to synesthetes. Synesthesia demonstrates that perception is not modular, is not strictly segregated by sensory modality, and in synesthetes there is cross-activation. There are connections between sensory areas that do not exist or are weaker in non-synesthetes, and these connections allow activity in one area to trigger activity in another. And when grapheme area, the region that processes letter and number shapes, is activated, it also activates colour area, the region that processes colour, and this cross-activation produces the experience of coloured letters. And neuroimaging studies have confirmed this, have shown that when synesthetes see numbers, colour areas of visual cortex are activated, are lit up, and this activation is automatic, is bottom-up, is not produced by conscious thought or imagination, but is triggered by the stimulus itself. Visualise the brain as having sensory areas that are normally separate: visual area, auditory area, taste area, and these areas process their respective inputs and pass information to higher level regions. But in synesthetes there are additional connections. There are pathways between sensory areas that allow direct crosstalk, and these pathways are the neural basis of synesthesia, are what allows stimulation in one modality to produce experiences in another. And the connections are not learned, are not created through experience, but are developmental, are present from early life. and synesthesia is lifelong, is consistent. The same cross-modal experiences occurring throughout the synesthete's life. The synesthesia paradox is that these experiences are perceptual, are as real as any other perception, and yet the properties perceived are not present in the stimulus. The number 5 is not blue, is black on white, and yet the synesthete sees blue. And this challenges theories that say perception is veridical, is accurate, is a representation of physical reality. And synesthesia shows that perception can include properties that are not in the world, that are generated internally, and yet these properties feel external, feel like properties of objects rather than like internal mental states. And this raises questions about the nature of perception, about what it means for perception to be of something, about whether all perception involves some degree of construction, some degree of adding properties that are not in the stimulus. One theory of synesthesia is that everyone is born with extensive cross-modal connections, that infant brains have connections between all sensory areas, and during development, most of these connections are pruned or eliminated, and sensory areas become more segregated. And in synesthetes, some of these early connections are preserved, are not pruned, and this preservation allows the cross-modal experiences to continue into adulthood. And this theory is supported by evidence that infants show some synesthetic effects, show cross-modal correspondences, and that synesthesia runs in families, has a genetic component, suggesting that genes that regulate synaptic pruning are involved. Another theory is that synesthesia involves disinhibition, involves normally present connections between sensory areas that are usually inhibited, are suppressed, and in synesthetes this inhibition is weakened, is less effective, and so the connections are active, allow cross-activation, and this theory is supported by evidence that synesthesia can be induced temporarily in non-synesthetes through drugs that reduce inhibition, through hypnosis, through sensory deprivation, suggesting that the neural machinery for synesthesia is present in everyone, but is normally inhibited, and synesthetes have less inhibition, have more open channels between sensory areas. Synesthesia also has practical implications. Some synesthetes report that their experiences are useful, provide memory aids, make information more distinctive, easier to remember, and some musicians with sound-colour synesthesia report that the colours help with composition, with understanding musical structure, and some artists deliberately cultivate synesthetic experiences, use them as sources of creativity. And understanding synesthesia has implications for education, for recognising that people process information differently, that sensory experiences vary across individuals, and that teaching should accommodate these differences, should recognise that some students have richly coloured experiences of letters and numbers, while others do not. The phenomenon also raises questions about consciousness, about qualia, about the subjective properties of experience, because synesthetes have different qualia than non-synesthetes, have colour experiences that others do not, and this shows that consciousness is not uniform, is not the same across individuals, and qualia vary, and this variation is not just quantitative, is not just more or less of the same experience, but is qualitative, involves entirely different types of experience, and this challenges theories that say consciousness is universal, is the same for everyone, and supports theories that say consciousness is individual, is constructed by each brain in potentially different ways. And synesthesia is one example of this variation, is one way that consciousness can differ. Some philosophers argue that synesthesia shows that perception is not representational, does not represent external properties, because the colours seen by graphema colour synesthetes do not represent anything in the world. The number 5 is not blue, and yet the colour is perceived, and this challenges representational theories of perception, suggests that perceptual experiences are not always representations of external properties but can be internally generated responses. And synesthesia is a case where the response includes properties that are not being represented, And this raises questions about what makes perception representational, whether all aspects of perception are representations, or whether some are merely responses are produced by the perceptual system without representing anything external. The number appears black on white, and the synesthete sees blue, vivid, and automatic. The colour is as real as the number, is as perceptually present, and yet the colour is not there, is not in the stimulus, is generated by the brain, is a cross-modal activation, and the synesthesia paradox remains. Perception includes non-veridical properties, includes experiences that do not correspond to stimulus properties, and yet these experiences are automatic, are reliable, are as perceptually real as any other, and synesthesia endures as one of the most fascinating phenomena in neuroscience. A demonstration that sensory modalities are not strictly separate, that cross-modal connections exist, that perception can include internally generated properties, and that consciousness varies across individuals, includes experiences that are unique, that are not shared by everyone, and the colours remain overlaid on letters, triggered by sounds, evoked by tastes, and the cross-modal world of synesthetes continues, different from the world non-synesthetes perceive, richer in some ways, more confusing in others, and the phenomenon persists. The arrow paradox. Motion seems so simple, so obvious. An arrow flies through the air from bow to target, and no one doubts that it moves. Yet the ancient Greek philosopher Zeno of Elea posed a question that has troubled thinkers for over 2,000 years, a question about whether motion is even possible at all. And this is the arrow paradox, one of Zeno's many arguments against the reality of change and multiplicity. Consider an arrow in flight, frozen at a single instant of time. At that precise moment, the arrow occupies a specific region of space exactly equal to its own length and width. It is not in two places at once. It is simply where it is motionless, static, indistinguishable from an arrow at rest. At the next instant, the same is true. The arrow occupies a space equal to itself, motionless at that frozen moment, and at the next instant, and the next. And if time is composed of a sequence of such instants, then at every instant the arrow is motionless. And if the arrow is motionless at every instant, then how can it be said to move at all? For motion would require the arrow to be in more than one place at a single instant, or to be in a state of transition rather than a state of rest, and yet at any given instant there is no motion, only position. Zeno used this paradox to support the Eleatic philosophy of Parmenides, which held that change and motion are illusions, that reality is a single, unchanging whole, and that the apparent diversity and movement we perceive are mere deceptions of the senses. The arrow paradox strikes at the very concept of instantaneous velocity, the idea that an object has a speed at a single moment in time, and Aristotle attempted to refute Zeno by arguing that time is not composed of indivisible instants, but is continuous, that motion is not a series of static positions, but a process that unfolds over intervals, and that the paradox arises only if we mistakenly treat time as a collection of frozen moments, rather than a flowing continuum. Modern physics offers a different resolution through calculus, where velocity is defined as the derivative of position with respect to time, a limit that describes how position changes as the time interval approaches zero. And in this framework, instantaneous velocity is a well-defined concept. The arrow does have a speed at each moment, even though speed is not a property that can be observed in a single instant, but only inferred from the relationship between position and time. Yet some philosophers argue that the arrow paradox still points to something genuine and unresolved, a mystery about how the static and the dynamic relate, how a series of stillnesses can add up to motion, how being in a place can somehow become moving between places. Quantum mechanics adds another layer to the puzzle, because at the subatomic level, particles do not have definite positions and velocities simultaneously. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle states that the more precisely we know a particle's position, the less precisely we can know its momentum. And in some sense, the arrow paradox prefigures this strange quantum behavior, the idea that motion and position are not entirely compatible descriptions of reality. The paradox also connects to debates about the nature of time itself, whether time is discrete or continuous, whether it flows or is an illusion, whether the present moment is all that exists or whether past and future are equally real, and whether change is fundamental or derivative. Zeno's arrow hangs suspended in thought, motionless at every instant, yet undeniably in flight, a puzzle that refuses to vanish despite millennia of analysis, a reminder that even the most basic experiences, the flight of an arrow, the passing of time, the reality of motion, rest on assumptions that can be questioned, that beneath the surface of the obvious lies a tangle of conceptual difficulties that no amount of mathematics or physics has entirely smoothed away, and the arrow flies still, or perhaps it never moved at all, frozen forever in the paradox that bears its name. The barber paradox. In a small village, there lives a barber who follows a single rule. He shaves all and only those men in the village who do not shave themselves. And this rule seems simple enough until the question emerges: does the barber shave himself? And suddenly the logic collapses into contradiction. If the barber shaves himself, then he belongs to the group of men who shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he should not shave himself because he only shaves men who do not shave themselves. But if he does not shave himself, then he belongs to the group of men who do not shave themselves, which means according to the rule, he must shave himself because he shaves all men who do not shave themselves, and the loop tightens without escape, spinning endlessly between two impossible options. Bertrand Russell popularized this version of his own paradox as a way to make the abstract problem of self-referential sets more accessible, more human, more vivid, because a barber is easier to imagine than a set of all sets that do not contain themselves. Yet the logical structure remains identical, a rule that turns inward and devours its own coherence. The paradox reveals something unsettling about definitions and categories, that not all rules can be consistently applied, that language and logic can conspire to create situations that seem perfectly reasonable until examined closely, and then they shatter. Some philosophers argue that the barber simply cannot exist, that the rule itself is contradictory, and therefore no such barber could ever follow it in reality, while others suggest that the problem lies in assuming the rule must apply universally, that perhaps the barber is exempt from his own rule, or that the village contains no barber at all. The paradox also exposes the danger of self-reference, the way that statements or rules that loop back on themselves can generate infinite regress or outright contradiction. And this has implications far beyond barbershops, touching mathematics, computer science, law, and any system that attempts to regulate itself from within. In set theory, the barber paradox mirrors Russell's discovery that naive set theory permits the construction of sets that cannot exist without contradiction, forcing mathematicians to impose restrictions on which sets are allowed to form, creating hierarchies and boundaries to prevent self-reference from poisoning the system. The barber stands at the edge of reason, a figure trapped in a loop of his own making, unable to shave or not shave without violating the very rule that defines his existence, and in this way, he becomes a symbol of the limits of logic, a reminder that not every question has an answer, that some problems resist resolution no matter how carefully they are examined. The paradox lingers in the mind, a simple story about a man and a razor that somehow reveals a crack in the foundation of thought itself, and once noticed, it cannot be ignored, appearing again and again wherever rules turn inward, wherever systems attempt to contain themselves, wherever language reaches the boundary of what it can coherently express. The Allais paradox. Maurice Allais, a French economist and Nobel laureate, presented a pair of choices in 1953 that revealed a systematic pattern of preferences violating the independence axiom of expected utility theory, and this became known as the Allais paradox, one of the most influential demonstrations that human decision-making deviates from the prescriptions of standard rational choice theory. And the paradox shows that people's preferences can be influenced by irrelevant alternatives, by outcomes that occur in both options and should therefore cancel out, yet somehow affect which option is chosen. The first choice involves two lotteries. Lottery A offers a certain gain of $1 million, while Lottery B offers a 10% chance of winning $5 million, an 89% chance of winning $1 million, and a 1% chance of winning nothing. And when faced with this choice, most people prefer Lottery A, the certain million, preferring the sure thing to the gamble, even though the gamble has a higher expected value. And this preference reflects risk aversion, a common and generally accepted feature of human decision-making. The second choice involves two different lotteries. Lottery C offers an 11% chance of winning $1 million and an 89% chance of winning nothing, while Lottery D offers a 10% chance of winning $5 million and a 90% chance of winning nothing. And when faced with this choice, most people prefer Lottery D, the gamble with the higher potential payoff, accepting the slightly lower probability of winning in exchange for the much larger prize. The paradox emerges when these two preference patterns are analysed together, because the independence axiom of expected utility theory requires that if Lottery A is preferred to Lottery B, then Lottery C should be preferred to Lottery D. And the reason is that Lotteries A and B differ from Lotteries C and D only in that there is an 89% chance in both A and B of receiving $1 million, and in both C and D this 89% outcome is replaced with winning nothing, and this replacement should affect both lotteries equally, should not change the preference order, because the independence axiom says that preferences between lotteries should depend only on outcomes where the lotteries differ, not on outcomes that are the same in both. And the 89% probability mass is shifted in the same way for both pairs, and so if you prefer A to B, you should also prefer C to D. And if you prefer D to C, you should also prefer B to A. The typical pattern of preferences, A over B and D over C, cannot be represented by any utility function satisfying the expected utility axioms. And so the Allais paradox demonstrates that people systematically violate the independence axiom, that their preferences are sensitive to common outcomes in ways that expected utility theory does not permit. And this violation is robust, appearing in experiments with diverse populations, with real monetary stakes, with careful experimental design, and the paradox cannot be dismissed as error or confusion, but represents a genuine feature of human decision-making. The paradox has inspired alternative theories that can accommodate the observed preferences, including prospect theory, developed by Daniel Kahneman and Amos Tversky, which modifies expected utility theory by introducing reference points, by treating gains and losses differently, by allowing for probability weighting where people overweight small probabilities and underweight large probabilities. And these modifications can explain the Allais preferences, because in the first choice, the certainty of $1 million receives extra weight, making Lottery A more attractive, while in the second choice the small probabilities are overweighted, making the 10% chance of $5 million in Lottery D seem more appealing than the 11% chance of $1 million in Lottery C. Other theories include regret theory, where people anticipate the regret they would feel if they made the wrong choice. And this anticipated regret influences preferences in ways that violate independence, because the certain million in Lottery A avoids the regret of choosing the gamble and losing everything, while the choices between C and D do not have this asymmetry. And rank-dependent utility theory, which generalizes expected utility by allowing the utility of lotteries to depend not just on outcomes and probabilities, but on the rank ordering of outcomes, and this allows for preferences that violate independence while maintaining other desirable properties. The Allais paradox raises normative questions about rationality. Some argue that the independence axiom is a fundamental requirement of rational choice, that violating it leads to incoherence, to preferences that can be exploited through Dutch books or money pumps, to decision-making that is systematically suboptimal, and that people who exhibit Allais preferences are making mistakes and should revise their preferences to conform to expected utility theory. While others argue that the independence axiom, while mathematically convenient, is not a necessary condition for rationality, that it does not capture important aspects of how people value uncertain prospects, that preferences like those in the Allais paradox reflect legitimate concerns about certainty, regret, and the context of choice, and that we should revise our normative theories to accommodate these preferences rather than dismissing them as irrational. The paradox also has practical implications for economics and policy, because if people systematically violate independence, then markets may not function as standard theory predicts. Risk preferences may be context-dependent. Insurance and investment decisions may be influenced by framing effects, and policies designed to maximize expected utility may not align with what people actually prefer. And understanding these deviations from expected utility helps explain phenomena like the equity premium puzzle, the disposition effect, and other anomalies in financial markets and economic behavior. The lotteries sit before you, the choices must be made, and your preferences, revealed through your choices, tell a story about how you value certainty and risk, about how you weigh probabilities and outcomes, and the story violates the axioms of rational choice, violates the clean mathematical structure of expected utility theory, and yet the choices feel reasonable, feel justified, feel like they reflect something important about value and uncertainty that the theory misses, and the paradox persists. The gap between theory and behavior remains. The independence axiom is violated again and again in experiments and in life, and decision theorists must choose. Either insist that the axiom is normatively binding and that violators are irrational, or acknowledge that the axiom is too strong, that rational choice is more complex than expected utility allows, and that new theories are needed to capture the richness of human decision-making. And the Allais paradox remains a landmark, a decisive demonstration that classical rational choice theory does not fully describe or prescribe human behavior, a challenge that spawned new theories and new research programs, and a reminder that rationality is contested, that what counts as a reasonable choice depends on assumptions and frameworks that are themselves open to question, and the lotteries remain, the choices remain, the preferences remain, and the paradox endures, unsolved in the sense that no consensus has emerged about whether the preferences are rational or irrational, about whether we should revise our theories or our preferences, about whether independence is a negotiable axiom or a non-negotiable requirement. And the debate continues. Philosophers and economists and psychologists arguing about what rationality requires, about what humans actually do, and about the relationship between these two questions. The Abilene paradox: why groups choose what nobody wants. A family sits on a porch in Coleman, Texas, on a hot afternoon, comfortable, playing dominoes, and the father-in-law suggests driving to Abilene for dinner, 53 miles away in a car without air conditioning. And the suggestion is not enthusiastic, is tentative, but the son-in-law says sure, sounds good, not because he wants to go, but because he assumes others want to go, and he wants to be agreeable. And the wife says yes if you all want to go, and the mother-in-law says of course, and they all pile into the car and drive to Abilene in dusty heat, arrive hot and tired, eat mediocre food, drive back exhausted, and sitting on the porch again, someone admits they didn't really want to go, and then everyone admits they didn't want to go, admits they only agreed because they thought others wanted it, and the entire group took an action that no individual wanted. chose an outcome that everyone preferred to avoid. And this is the Abilene paradox, described by management professor Jerry Harvey, a phenomenon where groups make decisions that contradict the preferences of all members, where collective action diverges from individual preferences, not through majority rule or compromise, but through misperception, through failure to communicate, through assumptions about what others want. And the paradox reveals that agreement is not always consensus, that unanimous decisions can be unwanted by everyone. And the Abilene paradox shows a different kind of collective irrationality from Condorcet cycles or voting paradoxes. Shows irrationality that arises from social dynamics, from conformity pressure, from reluctance to dissent. And the paradox remains relevant for understanding group decision-making, for recognizing that groups can fail not just through conflict, but through false consensus, through everyone going along with what nobody wants. Imagine the psychology of each family member. Each sits on the porch comfortable, each prefers staying home, but each hears the suggestion and thinks, well, if someone is suggesting it, they must want it. I don't want to be the one who ruins everyone's plans. I should be agreeable. Go along, be a team player. And so each agrees despite preferring to stay, and no one voices their actual preference. No one says, I'd rather stay home. And the group collectively creates a false impression, creates the appearance of consensus when none exists, and everyone interprets others' agreement as reflecting genuine preference rather than social accommodation. And this mutual misperception drives the group toward an outcome no one wants. And the paradox unfolds. The trip is taken, the unwanted dinner eaten, and only afterward does truth emerge. Does communication clarify that everyone preferred staying home? And the group confronts the absurdity, the recognition that they did something no one wanted through failure to communicate authentically. The Abilene paradox differs from groupthink, where group members genuinely conform their preferences to the group, genuinely come to believe the group view. And Abilene involves no genuine preference change, involves only misperception, only assumption about what others want. And members maintain their private preferences, but suppress them out of social pressure, out of desire to be agreeable. And this suppression is the source of the paradox, creates the gap between public agreement and private preference, and the gap allows groups to pursue actions that everyone opposes. And breaking the paradox requires someone to voice dissent, to say, actually, I'd prefer not to go. And this dissent can reveal that others feel the same, can break the false consensus, but dissent is risky, is socially uncomfortable, requires challenging what appears to be group preference. And most people avoid this, prefer to go along, and the paradox persists. Visualize the Abilene paradox as a coordination failure, where the optimal outcome requires everyone to reveal their true preferences, requires honest communication, but social norms and psychological tendencies prevent this, create pressure toward agreement, toward accommodation, toward not rocking the boat. And these pressures are strongest when relationships matter, when group harmony is valued, when dissent risks social costs and family dinners and work teams and community groups all face Abilene risks. All can make decisions that no one wants, through false consensus, through failure to communicate authentically. And the paradox shows that agreement is not always good, that unanimous decisions can be wrong, that groups need mechanisms for authentic communication, need cultures that encourage dissent, need permission to disagree. One lesson from the Abilene paradox is the importance of honest communication, of creating environments where people feel safe expressing disagreement, where dissent is welcomed rather than punished. And organizations that suffer repeated Abilene paradoxes often have cultures of false harmony, have norms that discourage challenging proposals, have leaders who interpret dissent as disloyalty, and these cultures create conditions for Abilene, create pressure toward agreement, and preventing the paradox requires changing culture, requires valuing truth over harmony, requires encouraging people to voice concerns. And this is difficult, requires conscious effort, requires leadership that models disagreement, that rewards dissent, that avoids shooting messengers. Another lesson is about decision-making procedures, about how groups can avoid Abilene through structured processes, through anonymous voting, through devil's advocate roles, through explicit checking for consensus, through asking not just who agrees, but who disagrees and why. And these procedures create space for dissent, create permission to voice opposition, and reduce pressure toward false consensus. And effective groups use these procedures systematically, build them into decision-making, recognize that surface agreement may hide opposition, and these procedures are especially important for high-stakes decisions, for commitments that are costly to reverse. And the trip to Abilene is costly, is unpleasant for everyone, and could have been avoided with better communication. The Abilene paradox also appears in organizational settings, in corporations where teams pursue strategies that no one really supports, in committees that adopt policies no member wants, in groups that invest in projects everyone privately doubts, and these organizational Abilenes are costly, waste resources, damage morale, produce outcomes that serve no one's interests, and preventing them requires organizational awareness, requires training people to recognize Abilene dynamics, requires creating cultures where speaking up is safe, where dissent is valued, and many organizations fail at this. Have cultures of deference, have hierarchies, where subordinates agree with superiors even when privately opposed, and these cultures are Abilene-prone, create repeated paradoxes, and organizational effectiveness requires breaking these patterns. Some argue that the Abilene paradox is overstated, that genuine cases are rare, that most group decisions reflect genuine preferences of at least some members, and while everyone agreeing despite everyone opposing is uncommon, partial Abilene is more common, where some members oppose but remain silent, and the group pursues a course that a vocal minority supports while a silent majority opposes, and this partial Abilene is still problematic, still produces suboptimal outcomes, and preventing it still requires encouraging dissent, requires creating safety for opposition. The paradox also raises questions about responsibility, about who is responsible when groups make decisions no one wants, and the answer is everyone and no one. Everyone contributed through silence, through false agreement, through failure to voice opposition, but no one individually caused the outcome. No one individually chose wrongly. Each made a reasonable social decision to accommodate perceived group preferences, and the collective outcome is worse than any individual action merited. And this shows how social dynamics can produce results that exceed individual culpability, can create group failures that no individual intended, and avoiding such failures requires collective awareness, requires group-level solutions, requires changing communication patterns and decision procedures. The family sits on the porch afterward, hot and tired and annoyed, and someone admits they didn't want to go, and the admissions cascade, and everyone realizes the absurdity, realizes they collectively did something no one wanted, and the Abilene paradox is revealed, and laughter mixes with frustration, and the lesson is learned: the importance of honest communication, the danger of false consensus, the need to voice dissent, and the paradox remains a permanent reminder that groups can fail not just through conflict, but through excessive agreeableness, through mistaken assumptions about others' preferences, through social pressures that suppress authentic communication, and the Abilene paradox endures as a cautionary tale about group decision-making, a demonstration that agreement is not always consensus, that unanimous decisions can be wrong, and that preventing collective irrationality requires creating environments where dissent is safe, where truth is valued over harmony, and where groups communicate authentically rather than accommodating falsely. The Banach-Tarski paradox: a solid sphere can be decomposed into a finite number of pieces, which can then be reassembled using only rotations and translations to form two solid spheres each identical to the original. And this seems to violate conservation of volume, seems to create matter from nothing, seems to be impossible, and yet it is a theorem in mathematics, proven rigorously using the axiom of choice and the properties of infinite point sets. And this is the Banach-Tarski paradox, named after Stefan Banach and Alfred Tarski, who proved it in 1924. And the paradox reveals deep and counterintuitive features of infinite decompositions, of non-measurable sets, and of the relationship between mathematics and physical reality. The proof proceeds by decomposing the sphere into a finite number of pieces, typically 5 or 6, and each piece is a set of points, not a solid region with smooth boundaries, but a scattered, disconnected, infinitely complex collection of points. And these pieces are non-measurable, meaning they do not have well-defined volumes in the usual sense. They cannot be assigned a size using standard measure theory. And this is crucial because measurable sets cannot be duplicated. Conservation of volume holds for measurable sets, but non-measurable sets escape this constraint. They can be rearranged in ways that seem to violate intuition, and the Banach-Tarski paradox exploits this by constructing pieces that are so pathological, so wildly scattered, that they can be rotated and translated to form two complete spheres. The decomposition uses the axiom of choice, the principle that given any collection of non-empty sets, there exists a way to choose one element from each set, and the axiom of choice is independent of the other axioms of set theory. It cannot be proven or disproven from the standard axioms, and some mathematicians reject it precisely because it leads to results, like the Banach-Tarski paradox, results that seem absurd, and rejecting the axiom of choice avoids the paradox. But it also cripples large parts of modern mathematics. Many important theorems depend on the axiom of choice, and most mathematicians accept it despite its counterintuitive consequences. The paradox applies only to objects in 3-dimensional space, or higher. It does not work in 2 dimensions. A disk cannot be decomposed and reassembled into 2 disks. And this is because the group of rotations in the plane is amenable, meaning it admits a certain kind of averaging that prevents paradoxical decompositions, while the group of rotations in 3-dimensional space is non-amenable, and this non-amenability is what makes the Banach-Tarski paradox possible. The fact that rotations in 3 dimensions can be combined in ways that allow pieces to be moved around and duplicated. The paradox raises questions about the relationship between mathematical objects and physical objects, because while the Banach-Tarski theorem is mathematically rigorous, it does not imply that a physical sphere can be duplicated. The decomposition involves infinitely complex sets, pieces that are not solid regions but scattered collections of points, with no smooth boundaries, and such pieces cannot be physically realized, cannot be cut or manipulated, and so the paradox is a feature of mathematical idealizations rather than a claim about physical reality. And this distinction is important. The paradox shows that mathematical spheres treated as sets of points behave in strange ways, but it does not threaten conservation of mass or energy in physics, because physical objects are not sets of points but arrangements of atoms or fields or quantum states, and these are governed by physical laws that do not permit paradoxical duplication. Some mathematicians and philosophers argue that the Banach-Tarski paradox is not really a paradox but a theorem, a surprising result that reveals features of infinite point sets and non-measurable sets, and that calling it a paradox is misleading, suggesting contradiction when there is none, only counterintuitive behavior. And from this perspective, the paradox is valuable precisely because it challenges intuition, because it shows that infinite collections have properties that finite collections lack, that measure theory has limits, that the axiom of choice has strange consequences, and that mathematics is richer and stranger than naive expectations suggest. Others find the paradox troubling, a sign that something is wrong with the foundations, that the axiom of choice should be rejected or restricted, that non-measurable sets are pathological objects that should not be admitted into mathematics, and that theories which avoid such sets, like those based on constructive or intuitionistic logic, provide better foundations, and this debate reflects deeper disagreements about the nature of mathematical existence, about what kinds of objects mathematics should study, and about the role of intuition in guiding mathematical practice. The Banach-Tarski paradox also appears in discussions of probability and decision theory, because if a sphere can be decomposed into non-measurable pieces, then probability distributions on spheres must be carefully defined to avoid assigning probabilities to non-measurable sets. And this technical requirement reflects the same underlying issue, that not all collections of points can be measured, that probability requires measurability, and that attempting to assign probabilities to arbitrary sets leads to contradictions or paradoxes. The sphere sits on the table, solid and indivisible to the eye, but mathematically it is a set of infinitely many points. And the Banach-Tarski theorem says that these points can be partitioned into pieces, 5 or 6 strange scattered collections, and these pieces can be moved, rotated and translated and reassembled into 2 spheres, identical to the original, and the volume has doubled or seems to have doubled, but the pieces never had well-defined volumes. They were never measurable, and so nothing has been created, no conservation law has been violated, only the intuition that decomposition preserves size, and this intuition holds for finite decompositions, for measurable pieces, but fails for infinite non-measurable pieces, and the paradox endures, a theorem that sounds impossible, a result that challenges understanding, a demonstration that mathematics contains surprises, that infinity is stranger than imagination, that point sets behave in ways that solid objects do not, and that the axiom of choice, innocent as it seems, permits constructions that defy common sense, and the sphere duplicates, mathematically, if not physically. And the paradox remains, a permanent fixture in the landscape of mathematics, a result that students encounter with disbelief, that mathematicians accept as rigorous yet counterintuitive, and that philosophers debate as revealing something deep about the nature of mathematical objects, about the limits of measure theory, about the relationship between infinite idealization and finite reality, and the sphere sits there, unchanged and yet somehow doubled, a monument to the strangeness of infinity, to the power of the axiom of choice, and to the capacity of mathematics to prove truths that seem like impossibilities. The blind sight paradox, why some blind people can see without seeing. A patient suffers damage to the primary visual cortex, the region of the brain that processes visual information and produces conscious visual experience, and the damage is severe, destroys the tissue completely, and the patient reports being blind, reports seeing nothing, experiencing only darkness in the affected visual field, and vision tests confirm the blindness. The patient cannot identify objects placed in the blind region, cannot read letters, cannot describe colours or shapes, and by every standard clinical measure, the patient has lost vision in that part of their visual field. And yet something strange occurs. Experimenters place objects in the blind field and ask the patient to guess where they are, to point at them even though the patient cannot see them, and the patient protests, says this is pointless, says there is nothing to see, but when forced to guess, the patient points accurately, reaches correctly, identifies the location, and sometimes even the nature of objects at levels far above chance. And this ability, this capacity to respond to visual information without conscious visual experience is called blind sight, and it creates a paradox. The patient is both blind and not blind, both lacks vision and has vision, lacks conscious sight but retains unconscious visual processing. And this dissociation between conscious experience and information processing challenges our understanding of perception, challenges the relationship between consciousness and function, and raises questions about what vision is, whether seeing requires awareness whether perception requires experience. And this is the blind sight paradox, a phenomenon that reveals that consciousness can be separated from processing, that the brain can use information without the person experiencing it. Imagine the blind sight patient's perspective, looking straight ahead, and part of the visual field is normal, contains conscious visual experience, objects and colours and shapes, and another part is blank, is darkness, is absence of experience, and experimenters place an object in the blind region, a ball perhaps, and ask where it is, and the patient says, "I don't know, I can't see anything there." And the experimenter says, "Just guess. Point to where you think it is," and the patient reluctantly points, randomly it seems. And yet the pointing is accurate, is directed toward the ball, and the patient is surprised. Says it was just a lucky guess, has no feeling of seeing, no visual experience that guided the response, and yet the accuracy persists, trial after trial. And the paradox is that the patient is using visual information, is processing it, is responding to it, but is not conscious of it, is not experiencing it. And vision has split into two components: conscious experience and information processing. And these normally go together, but in blind sight they come apart. The blind sight phenomenon has been documented in multiple patients, studied extensively, and the mechanism involves intact pathways from the eye to brain regions outside the primary visual cortex. Pathways that process visual information for action and navigation without producing conscious experience. And these pathways allow blind sight patients to respond to visual stimuli without seeing them. And the existence of these pathways shows that vision is not a single unified process, but involves multiple systems, some conscious and some unconscious. And damage to visual cortex eliminates conscious vision, but leaves unconscious visual processing intact. And this dissociation reveals something fundamental about consciousness, shows that information processing is not sufficient for conscious experience, that the brain can process and use information without that information becoming conscious. Visualize vision as having multiple components. One component processes information for conscious perception, for seeing in the ordinary sense, for having visual experiences, and another component processes information for action, for guiding behavior, for spatial navigation. And normally these components work together, are integrated, and we do not notice the distinction. But in blind sight, they separate. One component is destroyed while the other remains, and the patient has action vision without perceptual vision, can use visual information for pointing and reaching, but cannot experience that information, cannot see it. And this shows that conscious experience is not simply a byproduct of information processing, but is a specific kind of processing, localized in specific brain regions. And when those regions are damaged, consciousness is lost even though other forms of visual processing continue. The blind sight paradox challenges functionalist theories of consciousness. Theories that say consciousness is defined by functional roles, by what information does, by how it affects behavior, because in blind sight, visual information performs many of its normal functions, guides behavior, enables responses, but does not produce conscious experience. And so consciousness is not identical to function, is something additional, is a specific kind of processing beyond mere responsiveness to stimuli. And this supports theories that distinguish between access consciousness, the availability of information for cognitive processes, and phenomenal consciousness, the subjective experiential quality. And blind sight shows that these can come apart, that information can be accessed and used without being phenomenally conscious. One response to the blind sight paradox accepts that it shows consciousness is separate from certain functions, from certain kinds of information processing, but argues that this does not threaten physicalism, does not show that consciousness is non-physical, only that it is a specific physical process localized in specific brain regions. And blind sight is a case where some visual processing continues without the processing that produces conscious experience, and this is compatible with consciousness being physical, being identical to certain patterns of neural activity, and the paradox shows which patterns are necessary for consciousness, shows that primary visual cortex is essential, and this is progress in understanding the neural correlates of consciousness. Another response questions whether blindsight patients truly lack conscious experience, argues that they might have degraded or partial visual experiences that they do not recognize as vision, that do not match their expectations of what seeing should feel like. And when they say they see nothing, they mean they have no clear, vivid visual experience, but they might have vague feelings, subtle impressions that guide their guesses, and these impressions might be minimal forms of consciousness rather than pure unconscious processing, and this response denies the complete dissociation, argues that some phenomenology remains in blindsight even if it is not ordinary visual phenomenology. A third response embraces the paradox as revealing that consciousness is not necessary for many cognitive functions, that unconscious processing is far more powerful than we thought, that the mind operates largely without awareness and consciousness is only the tip of the iceberg, a small subset of mental processes, and blindsight is an extreme case, but similar dissociations occur in normal cognition, where we process information, make decisions, guide behavior without conscious awareness. And the paradox shows that consciousness, rather than being essential to cognition, is a specialized feature that occurs only in certain conditions, for certain kinds of information processing. The blindsight paradox also has implications for debates about animal consciousness, about which animals are conscious, because if information processing without consciousness is possible in humans, then it might be the norm in simpler animals. Animals might respond to stimuli, navigate environments, exhibit complex behaviors without having conscious experiences, without there being anything it is like to be them. And this makes determining animal consciousness more difficult, makes behavioral evidence insufficient, because behavior can be produced by unconscious processing, as blindsight demonstrates. The patient sits in the laboratory, the blind field tested again and again, and each time the accuracy surprises, the pointing succeeds, the guessing is correct, and the patient insists they see nothing, feel nothing, experience nothing in that region, and yet the information is there, is being used, is guiding behavior, and the paradox persists. Vision without seeing, processing without experience, function without phenomenology, and the blindsight paradox remains one of the most important phenomena in consciousness research. A real-world demonstration that conscious experience and information processing can dissociate, that the brain can use information the person does not consciously access, and that consciousness is not reducible to function, is something specific, something localized, something that can be lost while other aspects of vision remain. And the phenomenon continues to challenge theories of consciousness, continues to provide evidence about the neural basis of awareness, and continues to raise questions about what consciousness is, what purposes it serves, why it exists, and whether it is necessary for cognition or is instead a luxury, an addition, something that happens only when certain brain regions process information in certain ways. And the blindsight patient reaches into darkness and touches the object, accurate despite seeing nothing, and the paradox endures. The Chinese room argument, why understanding takes more than following rules. A philosopher sits alone in a room, and through a slot in the door come pieces of paper with Chinese characters written on them. And the philosopher does not understand Chinese, cannot read the characters, has no idea what they mean, but the philosopher has a rule book, an enormous book of instructions written in English that specifies for every possible input what output to produce. And the rules are purely syntactic. Say things like, if you receive these characters, then copy these other characters onto paper and send them out. And the philosopher follows the rules mechanically, receives Chinese input, looks up the appropriate response in the rule book, writes the Chinese characters, and sends the paper out through the slot. And to outside observers who understand Chinese, the responses are perfect, are indistinguishable from responses a native Chinese speaker would give. The system appears to understand Chinese, appears to be conversing intelligently, and yet the philosopher inside understands nothing, is merely manipulating symbols according to formal rules. And this is John Searle's Chinese room argument, proposed in 1980 as a challenge to strong AI, to the claim that running the right program is sufficient for understanding, is sufficient for genuine cognition, and the argument aims to show that syntax is not sufficient for semantics, that symbol manipulation is not sufficient for meaning, that computers running programs are like the philosopher in the room, manipulating symbols without understanding what they mean. Imagine the situation from the philosopher's perspective, sitting with the rule book, receiving incomprehensible squiggles, looking up responses, writing more incomprehensible squiggles, and sending them out. And at no point does understanding occur, at no point do the symbols acquire meaning. The philosopher remains ignorant of Chinese throughout the process despite producing perfect Chinese responses. And Searle's point is that if the philosopher does not understand Chinese, then neither does any computer system that works the same way, that processes inputs according to formal rules to produce outputs. And since all computer programs work by manipulating symbols according to formal rules, no computer program can produce genuine understanding, can produce semantics, no matter how sophisticated the program, how large the rulebook, how perfect the response is. The argument is directed against the computational theory of mind, against the idea that cognition is computation, that thinking is symbol manipulation, that minds are programs running on brains. And Searle argues that this view is false, that minds have more than computational properties, that understanding requires something beyond syntax, something like intentionality, the capacity for thoughts to be about things, to have meaning, and intentionality is not a computational property, is not something that emerges from symbol manipulation. And so computers, which are purely computational systems, cannot have genuine understanding, cannot have genuine intelligence, no matter how complex their programs. Visualize the difference between a human understanding Chinese and the system of the room. The human has intentional states, has thoughts that are about things, knows what words mean, knows what is being said, while the room system has only syntax, has only formal symbol manipulation, and the symbols in the room are not about anything, do not mean anything to the system, are just meaningless marks manipulated according to rules. And Searle argues that this difference is fundamental, that no amount of syntactic processing can produce genuine semantics, cannot bridge the gap between meaningless symbols and meaningful thoughts. The Chinese room argument has generated enormous discussion and numerous objections. The system's reply argues that while the philosopher does not understand Chinese, the system as a whole, the philosopher plus the rulebook plus the room, does understand Chinese, and understanding is a property of the system, not of the components. And Searle responds that this misses the point, that even considering the entire system, there is nothing that understands Chinese. The system is still just manipulating symbols and internalizing the rulebook. Imagining the philosopher memorizes all the rules does not help. The philosopher still does not understand Chinese, still is just following rules. The robot reply argues that a computer embedded in a robot body, with sensors and actuators, with the ability to interact with the world, could ground symbols in experience, could connect symbols to things, and this grounding would provide semantics, would provide understanding. And Searle responds that this just adds more symbol manipulation. The robot receives perceptual inputs, processes them through programs, produces motor outputs, but all of this is still syntactic, still formal symbol manipulation, and adding perception and action does not add semantics, does not add understanding. The robot is just a Chinese room with cameras and arms. The brain simulator reply argues that if the program simulated the actual brain processes involved in understanding Chinese, neuron by neuron, then running the program would produce understanding. Because understanding is what brains do, and the simulation reproduces what brains do. And Searle responds with the thought experiment of replacing neurons with silicon chips one by one, and asks whether, at some point, understanding suddenly disappears, and argues that if understanding depends on specific biological properties of neurons, then simulation is insufficient. And if understanding depends only on computational properties, then simulation has them and still does not produce understanding, showing that computation is not enough. The Other Minds reply argues that we attribute understanding to other humans based on their behavior, and if a computer produces the same behavior, we should attribute understanding to it by the same reasoning. And Searle responds that this is an epistemological point about how we know others understand, but his argument is a metaphysical point about what understanding is, and behaviorally equivalent systems might differ in whether they genuinely understand, and the Chinese room shows that behavioral equivalence does not guarantee understanding. Supporters of strong AI have largely rejected the Chinese room argument, have argued that Searle begs the question by assuming there is something more to understanding than syntactic processing, that he relies on intuitions about the philosopher's lack of understanding without justifying those intuitions, and that if the system perfectly duplicates the behavior of a Chinese understander, then it is a Chinese understander. An understanding is not a mysterious inner property, but is constituted by the right functional organization, the right pattern of information processing, and the Chinese room system has that organization. The argument also raises questions about what understanding is, what makes the difference between genuine and merely apparent understanding, and whether there could be a fact of the matter about whether a system understands or whether understanding is something we attribute based on pragmatic considerations. And Searle argues that understanding involves consciousness, involves subjective experience, involves intentionality, and these are biological phenomena that cannot be duplicated by computation, while functionalists argue that understanding is a matter of functional organization, and any system with the right organization understands regardless of its physical implementation. The philosopher sits in the room, manipulating Chinese characters, following rules, producing perfect responses, and understanding nothing, and the question remains whether this thought experiment refutes strong AI, whether it shows that computation is insufficient for understanding, or whether it merely trades on intuitions about the thought experiment that should not be trusted. And the Chinese room argument persists as one of the most influential arguments in philosophy of mind and AI, an argument that has shaped debates about consciousness, intentionality, and the nature of minds, an argument that continues to challenge the computational theory of mind. And the room remains. The philosopher remains, following rules, producing symbols, understanding nothing, and Searle's challenge endures, demanding explanation of how syntax could ever produce semantics, how symbol manipulation could ever produce meaning, and the argument stands as a permanent thorn in the side of strong AI, a thought experiment that forces advocates of computational theories to explain what their theories cannot easily explain, how understanding emerges from computation, how minds can be programs, and whether machines can think. The Bell spaceship paradox. When two rockets pull a string apart, two identical spaceships float in space, separated by some distance, let us say 1 kilometer measured in their initial rest frame, and a thin thread connects the two ships, stretched taut but not under tension, and now both ships fire their rockets simultaneously, both accelerating at exactly the same rate, both reaching the same velocity at the same time as measured in the original rest frame. And the question arises, what happens to the thread? Does it break or does it remain intact? And the paradox is that two different lines of reasoning seem to give opposite answers. One argument says the thread remains intact because both ships accelerate identically and maintain constant separation in the original rest frame, while another argument says the thread must break because of length contraction, and this is Bell's spaceship paradox, proposed by physicist John Stuart Bell to clarify misconceptions about special relativity and the nature of length contraction. Consider the first argument. In the original rest frame, both ships start 1 kilometer apart, and both ships accelerate at the same rate, their velocities remaining equal at all times, and so the distance between them, as measured in the original rest frame, remains 1 kilometer throughout the acceleration. The ships maintain constant separation, as measured by rulers at rest in the original frame, and the thread, stretched between the ships, also spans 1 kilometer in this frame. And if the separation does not change, then why would the thread break? It experiences no increased tension, no stretching, and so the thread should remain intact. And this reasoning seems compelling, seems to follow directly from the symmetry of the situation. But now consider the second argument, from the perspective of someone accelerating with the ships, someone in the instantaneous rest frame of the spaceships at any given moment. And in this frame, the distance between the ships is undergoing length contraction relative to the original frame. The proper distance between the ships, the distance measured by a ruler moving with the ships, is greater than 1 kilometer, and growing because the ships are maintaining constant coordinate separation in the original frame, while length contraction says that moving objects are contracted. And so to maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame, the proper separation must increase, must stretch, and the thread, a physical object with a rest length, cannot stretch indefinitely without breaking, and so the thread must snap as the proper distance between the ships increases beyond the thread's breaking point. Bell's answer, and the correct answer according to relativity, is that the thread breaks. The second argument is correct, and the error in the first argument is subtle. It confuses coordinate distance in the original rest frame with proper distance measured by moving rulers. And length contraction does not mean that objects physically shrink in their own rest frame. It means that the relationship between coordinate distance in one frame and proper distance in another frame involves a contraction factor. And when two ships maintain constant coordinate separation in the original frame while accelerating, they are actually increasing their proper separation, the distance measured by rulers that move with them. And the thread, stretched between the ships, experiences this increasing proper separation as tension, and eventually the tension exceeds the thread's strength and it breaks. Imagine the situation more concretely. Place a series of markers at rest in the original frame, spaced 1 meter apart, stretching from the first ship to the second ship. And initially, there are 1,000 markers spanning the 1 kilometer between the ships. And now, the ships accelerate, and at any given instant in the original frame, the ships remain at the same markers they started at. The distance between them measured by these markers remains 1,000 meters, but from the perspective of the moving ships, the markers are getting closer together, are contracting, because the markers are in motion relative to the ships. And so the ships see more and more markers passing between them. The number of markers spanning the gap increases, and this means the proper distance between the ships is increasing, and the thread, which has a fixed rest length, cannot span this increasing proper distance, and it breaks. The paradox reveals a common misconception about special relativity, the idea that if two objects start with a certain separation and undergo identical accelerations, then they must maintain the same separation. But this is false. Maintaining the same coordinate separation in one frame requires increasing proper separation when the objects are accelerating. And this is because acceleration is not relative in the way velocity is. Accelerating objects experience forces, have proper accelerations that can be measured by accelerometers on board, and two spaceships with identical proper accelerations do not maintain constant proper separation. They drift apart in their own instantaneous rest frames. Bell used this paradox to clarify that length contraction is a real physical effect, not merely a coordinate artifact or an optical illusion. The thread really breaks. Real physical forces are involved, and the contraction of moving objects is a consequence of how electromagnetic forces between atoms transform under Lorentz boosts. And these forces are what hold matter together, what give objects their rigidity, and when objects accelerate, the forces adjust. And in the Bell spaceship scenario, the adjustment causes the thread to experience tension and eventually to snap. The paradox also connects to the Ehrenfest paradox, another puzzle in special relativity involving rotation and length contraction, where a disk spinning at relativistic speeds seems to have a contracted circumference but unchanged radius, leading to apparent contradictions with Euclidean geometry. And both paradoxes illustrate that accelerated motion introduces subtleties that are not present in inertial motion, that naive applications of length contraction can lead to errors, and that careful analysis using the full machinery of special relativity is required to get the right answers. Visualize the two spaceships accelerating in lockstep, their separation constant as measured by observers at rest, but the thread between them stretching from the ship's perspective, growing taut, fibers straining and eventually snapping, breaking in the middle, the two halves trailing behind each ship, and the observers at rest see the thread break. Even though the ships never changed their coordinate separation, and this breaking is real, is frame independent, all observers agree that the thread broke, though they may disagree about why, about what forces were involved, but the physical fact of the breaking is invariant, is an event in spacetime that everyone can observe. Bell's spaceship paradox remains a challenging problem in relativity pedagogy. Many students, and even some physicists, initially get it wrong, arguing that the thread should not break, and the paradox serves as a test of whether someone truly understands length contraction and the relativity of simultaneity, whether they can correctly apply these concepts to accelerating objects. And the paradox has generated extensive discussion in physics journals, with papers clarifying the resolution and exploring variations. And it stands as a reminder that special relativity, despite being over a century old, still contains subtleties that require careful thought, that intuitions about space and time must be constantly checked against the formalism, and that even seemingly simple scenarios can hide deep complexities. The rockets fire, the ships accelerate, maintaining constant spacing in the original frame, and the thread stretches, taut and straining, and then snaps, unable to bridge the growing proper distance. And Bell's paradox resolves, the thread breaks, relativity vindicated, and the lesson learned that acceleration changes things, that maintaining coordinate separation requires increasing proper separation, that length contraction is real and physical, and that relativity continues to surprise, continues to challenge intuition, continues to reward careful analysis with deeper understanding of how space and time and motion interweave to create the strange but consistent fabric of relativistic physics. The boy or girl paradox. A family has two children, and you're told that at least one of them is a boy, and the question is posed, what is the probability that both children are boys? And the intuitive answer is 1/2, because the other child is either a boy or a girl with equal probability, but this reasoning is incorrect. The actual probability is 1/3, and this is the boy or girl paradox, a puzzle in conditional probability that has generated confusion and debate for decades, with different versions yielding different answers depending on exactly how the information is obtained and what assumptions are made about the selection process. The solution proceeds by considering all possible, equally likely combinations of two children. There are 4 possibilities: boy-boy, boy-girl, girl-boy, girl-girl, and girl-girl, where the order matters because the first child and second child are distinct even if both are boys or both are girls. And if we are told that at least one child is a boy, then the girl-girl possibility is eliminated, leaving 3 equally likely cases: boy-boy, boy-girl, and girl-boy. And only in one of these 3 cases are both children boys, and so the probability is 1/3, not 1/2. The paradox arises because the conditioning statement, at least one is a boy, is not the same as knowing the gender of a specific child. If instead we are told that the older child is a boy or the younger child is a boy, then the probability that both are boys becomes 1/2, because we are conditioning on a specific child being a boy rather than on the existential claim that at least one child somewhere in the family is a boy. And this distinction, subtle as it seems, makes a crucial difference to the probability calculation. The boy or girl paradox has many variations that probe the boundaries of the problem and reveal how sensitive the answer is to the exact specification of the scenario. One famous variant involves meeting a man who says he has 2 children, and one of them is a boy named Tuesday, meaning the boy was born on a Tuesday, and this additional information about the day of the week changes the probabilities in a surprising way, because it reduces the number of scenarios consistent with the statement, and the probability that both children are boys increases from 1/3 to 13/27. And this result seems bizarre, seems like the day of the week should be irrelevant, but the mathematics is sound. The additional specificity affects the conditional probabilities. Another variation asks, what if you meet a man with 2 children, and you see one of them, a boy? Does this change the answer? And the answer is yes. Seeing a specific boy is different from being told that at least one child is a boy, because seeing introduces selection effects. You are more likely to see a boy in families with 2 boys than in families with 1 boy, and so the probability calculation must account for the process by which the information was obtained, and different processes lead to different answers. And this sensitivity to selection effects is a general feature of conditional probability problems, and it explains why the boy or girl paradox has multiple defensible answers depending on the scenario. The paradox connects to the reference class problem and to debates about the principle of indifference, because applying the principle of indifference requires specifying a reference class, a set of equally likely outcomes, and different choices of reference class lead to different probability assignments. And in the boy or girl paradox, the reference class could be families with at least 1 boy, or it could be situations where someone tells you that at least one child is a boy. And these are different reference classes with different probabilities. And there is no neutral or obvious way to choose between them without more information about how the scenario is set up. The paradox also raises questions about the interpretation of probability statements in natural language, because phrases like "at least one is a boy" can be interpreted in different ways, as a statement about the existence of a boy in the family, as a statement about what someone knows or has observed, or as a statement about what information has been communicated, and each interpretation leads to different formal models and different probability calculations. And this ambiguity in natural language is a source of many probability paradoxes, where the mathematical answer depends on details that are not fully specified in the informal statement of the problem. Bayesian statisticians and frequentists also interpret the paradox differently. Bayesians treat probability as degrees of belief and calculate conditional probabilities using Bayes' theorem, while frequentists treat probability as long-run frequencies and may question whether the conditional probability is well defined without specifying a clear sampling procedure. And these different philosophical approaches to probability lead to different emphases in how the paradox is understood and resolved, though both traditions agree on the mathematical calculations once the problem is precisely formulated. The boy or girl paradox has practical analogues in genetics and medicine, where the probability of certain conditions depends on family history in ways that are similar to the structure of the paradox. For instance, the probability that a family carries a recessive genetic trait depends on how many children are observed to have the trait, and the calculations must account for ascertainment bias, the fact that families are more likely to come to medical attention if they have affected children, and this bias affects the probability assessments in ways that parallel the selection effects in the boy or girl paradox. The family walks down the street, 2 children beside them, and you know that at least one is a boy. And the question remains, what is the probability that both are boys? And the answer depends on how you came to know this fact, on whether you asked about a specific child or about any child, on whether you saw a boy or were merely told that at least one exists, and each variation of the scenario changes the answer, shifts the probabilities, reveals that conditional probability is sensitive to context, to process, to the mechanisms by which information is acquired and communicated, and the paradox persists as a puzzle, as a teaching tool, as a demonstration of how subtle probability can be, how carefully problems must be formulated, how easily intuition can mislead. And the boy walks ahead, evidence of his existence, shifting probabilities, conditioning beliefs, and the mathematics unfolds, precise and unforgiving, calculating 1/3 or 1/2 or 13/27, depending on the details, and the intuition struggles to keep up, struggles to grasp why the day of the week matters, why seeing is different from being told, why reference classes and selection effects have such profound impacts on what should be simple questions, and the paradox endures, unsettled in the sense that people continue to disagree about which answer is correct for which version, continue to debate whether the problem is well posed, continue to find new variations that test the boundaries of conditional probability, and the family continues walking. The boy or boys or boy and girl continue existing, and the question remains open, answerable only when the scenario is specified with enough precision to eliminate ambiguity, to fix the reference class, to determine the selection process, and until then, the paradox lives on. A reminder that probability is not just mathematics, but interpretation. Not just calculation, but careful attention to how information is obtained, how questions are asked, and how evidence is generated. The bootstrap paradox. There exists a strange loop in time where cause and effect chase each other in a circle, where information or objects appear from nowhere, with no origin, no creator, no beginning, and this is the bootstrap paradox, named after the impossible act of pulling oneself up by one's own bootstraps, a paradox that emerges whenever time travel creates a causal loop that has no starting point. Imagine a time traveler who loves a particular symphony, and one day they decide to travel back in time to meet the composer, but when they arrive in the past, they discover that the composer has not yet written the symphony, and so the time traveler, eager to hear the music again, writes down the notes from memory and gives them to the composer, who then publishes it as their own work, and the symphony becomes famous, and years later, the time traveler hears it and falls in love with it and decides to travel back in time to meet the composer, and the loop is complete. The question that haunts this scenario is simple and unanswerable. Who actually composed the symphony? The composer received it from the time traveler, and the time traveler received it from the composer, and neither of them created it. The information simply exists within the loop, passed from future to past and back again, with no point of origin, no moment of creation, no author. The bootstrap paradox differs from the grandfather paradox because it does not involve contradiction. The timeline is perfectly self-consistent. Every event follows logically from every other event. There is no clash between cause and effect, and yet something feels deeply wrong, an intuition that things must come from somewhere. That information cannot simply exist without being created. The paradox appears in many variations: a book that writes itself, a watch that is given to a younger version of oneself, who then keeps it for decades before giving it back, a technology that is brought from the future and used to invent itself, and in each case the object or information becomes eternal, trapped in a loop of time, aging perhaps, but never truly beginning or ending. Some physicists accept the bootstrap paradox as a genuine possibility if time travel is real, arguing that closed time-like curves, paths through space-time that loop back on themselves, are permitted by general relativity under certain conditions, and that such loops might allow for causally self-sufficient systems where the past and future are mutually dependent. Others find the paradox deeply troubling, a sign that something is wrong with our understanding of causation, entropy, or time itself, because information in a loop would violate the second law of thermodynamics, which states that entropy always increases, that order does not arise spontaneously from disorder, and yet in a bootstrap loop, the information appears to be perfectly preserved, never degrading, never increasing in entropy, existing in a kind of timeless stasis. The many worlds interpretation offers one way out, suggesting that the time traveler who delivers the symphony creates a new branch of reality, and that in their original timeline, the symphony had a different origin, but this solution feels like cheating, multiplying universes to avoid the discomfort of the loop. The bootstrap paradox forces confrontation with deep questions about the nature of causation, whether causes must always precede effects, whether the universe permits closed causal loops, and whether existence itself requires an ultimate origin, or whether some things can simply be eternal and self-caused, through time without beginning or end, defying the intuition that everything must come from something, that there must always be a first cause, a prime mover, a starting point from which all else flows. The Bertrand's box paradox. 3 identical boxes sit before you, each containing 2 coins. The first box contains 2 gold coins, the second box contains 2 silver coins, and the third box contains 1 gold coin and 1 silver coin. And you cannot see inside the boxes, cannot distinguish them from the outside. And a box is chosen at random and opened, and 1 coin is drawn from it, also at random, and the coin turns out to be gold. And now a question is posed that seems simple, but leads to surprising confusion. What is the probability that the other coin in the same box is also gold? And the intuitive answer that most people give is 1/2, reasoning that since the drawn coin is gold, the box cannot be the one with 2 silver coins. So it must be either the box with 2 gold coins or the box with 1 gold and 1 silver. And these 2 possibilities seem equally likely, and so the probability that the other coin is gold should be 1/2. But this reasoning is wrong. The correct answer is 2/3, and this is Bertrand's box paradox, named after Joseph Bertrand, who presented it in 1889, a puzzle in conditional probability that reveals how easily intuition misleads when reasoning about random processes and conditional information. The error in the intuitive reasoning lies in treating the 2 remaining boxes as equally likely, but they are not, because the probability calculation must account for how the gold coin was observed, must condition not just on which box was chosen, but on which coin was drawn. And the key insight is that there are 3 gold coins in total, 2 in the first box and 1 in the third box, and the drawn coin is equally likely to be any of these 3. And if the drawn coin is one of the 2 from the first box, then the other coin in the same box is also gold, while if the drawn coin is the one from the third box, then the other coin is silver. And since 2 of the 3 equally likely possibilities lead to the other coin being gold, the probability is 2/3, not 1/2. Another way to see the solution is to consider all possible outcomes. There are 6 coins in total, labelled gold 1 and gold 2 in the first box, silver 1 and silver 2 in the second box, and gold 3 and silver 3 in the third box, and each coin is equally likely to be the one drawn. And we're told that a gold coin was drawn, which eliminates silver 1, silver 2 and silver 3, leaving gold 1, gold 2 and gold 3 as equally probable. And if gold 1 was drawn, then the other coin in the same box is gold 2. If gold 2 was drawn, then the other coin is gold 1. And if gold 3 was drawn, then the other coin is silver 3. And so in 2 of the 3 cases, the other coin is gold, giving a probability of 2/3. The Bertrand box paradox is structurally similar to other probability puzzles, like the Monty Hall problem and the 3 prisoners problem, where conditioning on partial information updates probabilities in non-obvious ways, where the process by which information is revealed matters as much as the content of the information, and where naive intuition fails to properly account for the structure of the problem, and the paradox illustrates the importance of specifying the sample space carefully, of identifying all possible outcomes and their probabilities, and of using Bayes' theorem or other formal tools to update probabilities rather than relying on informal reasoning. The paradox also raises questions about the reference class problem, about which population of events the observed outcome should be considered a member of, because the intuitive error involves thinking of the outcome as selecting a box type, either 2 gold or mixed, rather than selecting a particular coin. And this shift in reference class changes the probabilities, and the correct solution requires identifying the right reference class, the set of all coins that could have been drawn, and calculating probabilities relative to that set. Bertrand's box paradox has pedagogical value. It is often used in teaching probability to illustrate conditional probability, to show how careful reasoning differs from intuitive judgment, and to demonstrate the value of systematic methods like constructing probability trees or using Bayes' theorem. And students who understand the paradox gain insight into a common class of errors that arise from failing to properly condition on all relevant information, from treating distinct events as equiprobable when they are not, and from confusing the probability of a hypothesis given evidence with the probability of evidence given a hypothesis. The paradox also appears in variations, sometimes with coloured balls instead of coins, sometimes with different numbers of boxes or different distributions, and each. Variation tests slightly different aspects of probabilistic reasoning, but the core lesson remains the same, that conditional probabilities must be calculated carefully, that intuition is unreliable, and that formal methods are necessary to avoid systematic errors. And the paradox connects to real-world situations where similar reasoning is required. Medical diagnosis, where symptoms must be interpreted in light of disease prevalence and test reliability, legal reasoning, where evidence must be weighed in light of prior probabilities and alternative explanations, and machine learning, where classifiers must be trained to properly account for base rates and conditional dependencies. The boxes sit on the table, indistinguishable from the outside. The gold coin gleams in your hand, and the question hangs in the air: what is the probability that the other coin is also gold? And the answer, 2/3, contradicts the intuitive 1/2, and the gap between intuition and mathematics reveals something about how we reason about chance, about how we estimate probabilities, about how we update beliefs in light of evidence. And the Bertrand box paradox remains a touchstone, a simple puzzle with a surprising answer, a demonstration that probability is subtle, that conditioning changes things in non-obvious ways, and that even questions that seem straightforward can hide complexity, can require careful analysis to answer correctly. And the paradox endures as a teaching tool, a cautionary tale, a reminder that mathematical reasoning is necessary to avoid errors that intuition cannot prevent. And the gold coin sits there, evidence that shifts probabilities, information that updates beliefs, and the calculation proceeds, formal and precise, yielding 2/3, and the intuition retreats, humbled by mathematics, corrected by careful thought, and the lesson is learned again, that probability is counterintuitive, that conditional reasoning is hard, and that paradoxes like Bertrand's box serve an essential function, exposing the gaps between how we think we reason and how we actually should reason, between the quick judgments of intuition and the slow calculations of mathematics. And the boxes remain coins inside, waiting to teach the next student, to confound the next intuition, to reveal once more that chance and evidence interact in ways that defy expectation. And the paradox persists, elegant and instructive, a permanent fixture in the pedagogy of probability, a puzzle that generations of students have encountered and been surprised by, and will continue to encounter as long as probability is taught and intuition needs correction. The binding problem: how your brain unites what it processes separately. A neuroscientist examines how the brain processes visual information, discovers that different features of objects are processed in different brain regions. Color is processed in one area, motion in another, shape in a third, orientation in a fourth, and all these features are analyzed separately, by specialized modules, by distinct populations of neurons. And yet when you look at a red ball moving to the right, you do not experience color, motion, and shape as separate. Do not see redness here and roundness there and rightward motion elsewhere, but see a unified object, a red round ball moving right, and all the features are bound together, are experienced as properties of a single thing. And this creates the binding problem, the puzzle of how the brain, which processes features separately, creates unified conscious experiences, how separate neural processes give rise to integrated perception, how the many become one. And this problem is fundamental, touches on the nature of consciousness, on how neural activity becomes experience, on what unifies experience into coherent wholes, and no complete solution exists. Various theories have been proposed, but the binding problem remains one of the deep mysteries of neuroscience, a gap between our understanding of neural processing and our understanding of consciousness. Imagine the visual system as a factory, with different departments processing different aspects of the product. One department handles color, another handles shape, another handles location, and all work in parallel, all process simultaneously, and each department produces its output color information, shape information, location information, and somehow these separate outputs must be combined, must be integrated into a unified representation, must be bound together so that you experience a red ball rather than redness and roundness as separate unlocalized features. And the binding problem asks how this combination occurs. What mechanism ensures that the right features are bound together, that the redness is attributed to the round object and not to the square object that happens to be present in the scene. And this correct attribution, this accurate binding, is critical for coherent perception, for navigating the world successfully, and yet how the brain achieves it remains unclear. The binding problem has two aspects: the feature binding problem, which asks how different features of the same object are bound together, and the object binding problem, which asks how different objects are kept separate, are not confused with each other, and both aspects are challenging. Both reveal that perceptual unity is not given automatically by neural processing, but requires some mechanism, some process that groups features appropriately, and various mechanisms have been proposed. Attention has been suggested as a solution. The idea that attention binds features, that attended objects have their features integrated, while unattended objects do not. And this explains why feature binding errors occur when attention is diverted, why illusory conjunctions occur where features from different objects are misbound, are attributed incorrectly. Visualize attention as a spotlight that illuminates objects one at a time, and within the spotlight features are bound, are integrated, and outside the spotlight features remain separate, are not integrated, and this attentional binding theory has some support, has experimental evidence showing that feature binding requires attention, that without attention, features can be perceived separately without being bound correctly, and illusory conjunctions are more common under conditions of inattention, supporting the idea that attention is necessary for binding. But attention cannot be the complete solution, because some binding occurs pre-attentively. Some feature integration happens automatically before attention is applied, and so attention is part of the story, but not the whole story. Another proposed mechanism is temporal synchrony, the idea that neurons representing features of the same object fire in synchrony, fire together, and this synchrony is the binding code, is what marks features as belonging together and neurons representing different objects. fire at different times or with different phases, and this temporal separation keeps objects distinct, prevents their features from being bound together. And this synchrony theory has been influential, has generated extensive research, has led to discovery of synchronized neural oscillations in visual cortex, but the theory faces challenges. It is not clear that synchrony is sufficient for binding, it is not clear that consciousness depends on synchrony, and some experiments have failed to find the predicted correlations between synchrony and perceptual binding, and the theory remains controversial. A third approach argues that binding occurs through convergence, through hierarchical processing, where features are combined in higher-level areas, and early visual areas process features separately, but project to higher areas that represent combinations, that have neurons responding to specific conjunctions of features. And these conjunction neurons represent bound objects, represent integrated wholes, and binding is achieved through this hierarchical architecture, through neurons that explicitly encode feature combinations. And this approach has support from single neuron recordings showing that higher visual areas have neurons with complex selectivity, neurons that respond to specific combinations of shape and color and motion, and these neurons could be the neural basis of bound object representations. The binding problem also connects to consciousness, because unified conscious experience seems to require binding, seems to require that separate neural processes be integrated into coherent wholes, and some theories of consciousness, like integrated information theory, make integration central, argue that consciousness arises from integrated information, from systems where different parts interact and constrain each other, and binding as a form of integration is the combination of separately processed features into unified representations. And understanding binding may be crucial for understanding consciousness, may reveal how neural processes give rise to unified experience. The problem also has practical implications for understanding neurological conditions where binding fails, where patients see features but cannot bind them correctly, and such conditions exist. Balint syndrome is one example, where patients can see individual features but cannot perceive objects, cannot integrate features into wholes. And these patients provide evidence that binding is a genuine process, is not automatic, can be disrupted by brain damage. And studying these patients helps understand normal binding, helps identify the brain regions and processes necessary for feature integration. Some philosophers argue that the binding problem is really a problem about consciousness, about how physical processes give rise to subjective experience, about the hard problem, and binding is one aspect of this, is the problem of how separate neural processes give rise to unified conscious experiences. And solving the binding problem may require solving the hard problem, may require understanding how neural activity becomes experience. And this makes binding one of the deepest problems in neuroscience, a problem at the interface between neuroscience and philosophy of mind. The brain processes features separately, color here, motion there, shape elsewhere, and yet you see unified objects, see red round balls moving, see integrated wholes, and how this integration occurs, how the separate processes give rise to unified experiences, remains one of the great unsolved problems. The binding problem stands, challenging, fundamental, revealing a gap between our understanding of neural processing and our understanding of perception. And various theories exist, various mechanisms have been proposed. Attention, synchrony, convergence, but no theory is complete. No theory explains all aspects of binding, and the problem persists as one of neuroscience's deepest mysteries. A puzzle about how unity emerges from multiplicity, how the brain binds what it processes separately, and the question remains open. The mechanism remains elusive, and the binding problem endures. The coastline paradox, why no one can agree how long Britain's shore is. A mapmaker sits down to measure the length of the coastline of Great Britain, the perimeter of the island, the total distance around its shores, And this seems like a straightforward task, a matter of careful measurement and calculation. But the paradox is that the answer depends on the scale of measurement, on how closely you look, on what size ruler you use to trace the coast. And as the ruler gets smaller, as the measurement becomes more precise, the measured length increases without bound, growing larger and larger, approaching infinity. And so the coastline has no well-defined length, or rather, its length is infinite. Or rather, the question of length becomes meaningless for highly irregular shapes. And this is the coastline paradox, first articulated clearly by mathematician Benoit Mandelbrot, who used it to motivate the study of fractals, shapes that exhibit self-similarity and complexity at all scales. Imagine measuring the coastline with a 100-kilometer ruler, a straight stick 100 kilometers long, and you walk around the island placing the stick end to end, measuring each straight segment. And when you reach the starting point, you add up all the segments and get a total length, perhaps 4,000 kilometers, and this seems like a reasonable measurement. But now imagine using a 10-kilometer ruler instead, a shorter stick. And because the ruler is shorter, it can follow the bends and curves of the coast more closely. It does not cut across bays and headlands, but traces around them. And when you complete the circuit, the total length is longer, perhaps 5,000 kilometers, because the shorter ruler captures more detail, more twists and turns, that the longer ruler missed. And now imagine using a 1-kilometer ruler, even shorter, and it follows the coast even more closely, entering smaller inlets, tracing around individual rocks and peninsulas, and the measured length increases again, perhaps to 7,000 kilometers. Continue this process using shorter and shorter rulers, a 100-meter ruler, a 10-meter ruler, a 1-meter ruler, and each time the measured length increases, because each shorter ruler reveals new details, new irregularities, new ins and outs that the previous ruler smoothed over, and the coastline is fractal-like, exhibiting structure at every scale. Every time you zoom in, you find new complexity, new bays within bays, new peninsulas jutting from peninsulas. And so there is no scale at which the coast becomes smooth, no level of detail at which further refinement stops revealing new length. And if you continue to arbitrarily small rulers, measuring every pebble, every grain of sand, every molecule, the measured length grows without limit, approaching infinity. And so the coastline paradox concludes that the coastline has infinite length, or more carefully, that the concept of length as traditionally defined does not apply to highly irregular curves like coastlines. Mandelbrot used this paradox to introduce fractals, geometric shapes characterized by self-similarity and non-integer dimension. And he showed that coastlines, along with many other natural shapes like clouds, mountains, rivers, and trees, are better described by fractal geometry than by traditional Euclidean geometry. And fractals have a property called fractal dimension, a number that quantifies how much space the shape fills. And for a smooth curve, the dimension is 1. For a surface, the dimension is 2. But for fractals, the dimension can be a non-integer, like 1.2 or 1.5, indicating that the shape is more than a line, but less than a surface. And coastlines typically have fractal dimensions between 1 and 2, reflecting their intricate, space-filling character. The paradox has practical implications for geography and cartography, because if coastline length depends on measurement scale, then different measurements will give different answers. And there is no single correct answer to the question, how long is the coastline of Great Britain? The answer depends on what resolution of map you use, on what level of detail you include, and different countries and agencies use different conventions, sometimes specifying a minimum feature size or a standard ruler length. But these conventions are arbitrary, and different conventions give different lengths. And so coastline length is not an intrinsic property of the coastline, but a relational property that depends on the measurement method. The paradox also raises philosophical questions about measurement and the nature of geometric properties, because it suggests that some shapes do not have well-defined lengths, that the concept of length which works well for straight lines and smooth curves, breaks down for irregular shapes, and this is not a limitation of our measuring instruments, but a feature of the shapes themselves. And this raises the question of whether length is a fundamental property of all curves, or whether it is a concept that applies only to sufficiently regular curves. And fractals fall outside the domain where traditional geometric concepts apply. Visualize the coast as an infinitely jagged line, with bays and headlands at every scale. Zoom in on a section and you see smaller bays and headlands. Zoom in again and you see even smaller ones. And this pattern repeats forever. There is no smooth coastline at any level of magnification, only more and more detail, and so tracing the coast means following an infinitely intricate path, and the length of an infinitely intricate path is infinite. And this is the essence of the paradox, that complexity at all scales produces infinite length, that irregular shapes are fundamentally different from regular shapes, and that traditional geometry is inadequate to describe them. The coastline paradox also appears in other contexts, in measuring the length of borders between countries, in measuring the perimeter of cells or the surface area of lungs, both of which exhibit fractal-like structure with increasing detail at smaller scales. And in all these cases, the measured value depends on the scale of measurement, and there is no single correct answer, only a family of answers indexed by measurement resolution. And this multiplicity is not an error or a limitation, but a feature of the geometry, a reflection of the fact that irregular shapes do not have simple scalar properties like length or area in the traditional sense. The mapmaker gives up, unable to provide a single definitive number for the coastline length, or provides multiple numbers with caveats about measurement scale, and the coastline stretches around the island, infinitely detailed, infinitely long if measured with infinite precision, and the paradox remains a reminder that geometry is more complex than Euclid imagined, that natural shapes do not conform to circles and straight lines, that measurement depends on scale, and that some questions like how long is the coastline do not have simple answers, and Mandelbrot's fractals provide a framework for understanding this complexity, for describing and quantifying irregular shapes, and for recognizing that the world is full of structures that are neither one-dimensional nor two-dimensional, but somewhere in between. And the paradox endures, a touchstone in fractal geometry, a demonstration that infinity appears not just in abstract mathematics, but in concrete measurements of real physical objects, and the coastline remains, jagged and intricate, defying simple measurement, a natural fractal that reveals the limits of traditional geometry and the need for new mathematical tools to capture the complexity of the world. The card paradox. Imagine a card, simple and rectangular, lying flat on a table, and on one side is written a single sentence. The statement on the other side of this card is true, and already the mind begins to sense danger, a trap being set. The card is flipped over, and on the reverse side another sentence appears. The statement on the other side of this card is false. And now the contradiction is complete, a perfect loop of mutual negation that cannot be resolved no matter how many times the card is turned. If the first side is true, then the second side must be true, as the first side claims, but if the second side is true, then the first side must be false, as the second side claims, which contradicts the assumption that the first side is true. And if the first side is false, then the second side must be false, as the first side incorrectly claims it is true. But if the second side is false, then the first side must be true, as the second side incorrectly claims it is false, and the cycle spirals endlessly without rest. The card paradox is a variation of the liar paradox, but its physical form makes the contradiction feel more tangible, more concrete, a paradox that can be held in the hand and turned over and over as if repetition might somehow reveal a hidden answer that logic cannot provide. The paradox demonstrates how self-reference can be distributed across multiple statements rather than contained in a single sentence, showing that contradictions do not need to be immediate or obvious to be genuine, that they can emerge from relationships between statements rather than from the statements themselves. Philip Jourdan, a mathematician and logician, is often credited with popularizing this version of the paradox in the early 20th century, using it to explore the limits of truth and reference, and to illustrate the kinds of problems that plagued attempts to formalize logic and mathematics during that era. The card paradox also reveals something about the nature of truth itself, the way that truth is not a property that statements possess in isolation, but a relationship between statements and the world, or between statements and other statements. And when those relationships form closed loops, the concept of truth begins to break down. Some philosophers argue that the statements on the card are neither true nor false, but meaningless, that they fail to refer to anything outside themselves and therefore do not qualify as genuine propositions, while others suggest that the paradox exposes a flaw in the classical assumption that every statement must be either true or false, that perhaps some statements occupy a third category, undefined or indeterminate. The card sits on the table, innocent and menacing, a small object that contains an infinite problem, and no amount of flipping will resolve what is written on its surfaces. No clever interpretation will untangle the knot, and so it remains, a monument to the limits of language and logic, a reminder that not all questions have answers, that some truths are forever out of reach, caught in loops that reason cannot break.